Hi, Misha here, and this is an aircraft I've talked a bit about, at least in kind of passing, in the past. The Israeli Air Force Phantom, the F-4E, or as they knew it, the Kurnass, basically heavy hammer or sledgehammer. Pretty important aircraft, both in the Israeli Air Force and for Israeli-U.S. relations. And this 1/72 scale die-cast model from Hobbymaster is actually of the later version, their Kurnass 2000, which was kind of their major rebuild retrofit of the design. And I have it on one of the newer Hobbymaster stands, just so it can have all the tanks and stuff underneath it. So yeah, the Phantom is important. Why? Well, Israel expressed interest in this aircraft early on, around 1965. But at that time, America wasn't really game. They didn't want to give that kind of military aid to Israel. And Israel, at that time, was receiving Mirages from France, the Dassault Mirage. This would eventually lead to the Israeli copy, the Kafir, but that's a ways off at this point. But the situation would change in 1967 during and after the 6 Days War. Israel did a preemptive strike, and this caused France to embargo Israel, but also caused the USA to reevaluate its position. And in January of 1968, a new agreement was signed between the Johnson administration and the Israeli government to provide them with the first of many F-4E Phantoms. And from there, they would gear up. Some would end up being new manufacturer F-4Es. Others would end up being ex-U.S. Air Force F-4Es, later production ones that really were too late for much use in Vietnam. Anyway, deliveries would begin, and the first ones were accepted in September of 1969. And it wouldn't be long before they were put into combat. In fact, by October 22nd, they were being used to attack Israeli targets. Egyptian targets. It's been a long day. They would use them for air-to-air, but also air-to-ground. So this was a multi-role fighter. Basically, they needed aircraft, so they used it for whatever they could. The first victory against a MiG-21 flown out of Egypt was on November 11 of that year, but it wasn't but a month later when the first Israeli F-4 was shot down by a MiG in turn. And in 1970, there'd be more and more backs and forths, but Russian assistance, including Russian pilots flying out of Egypt, and newer Russian missiles, SAM sites, the SA-6, namely, kind of even the odds. And the F-4s did suffer some pretty heavy losses in the summer of 1970, and deliveries were still continuing from the USA. Fast forwarding a bit to the Yom Kippur War in 1973, they had around 122 of the F-4Es in service and 6 of the RF-4E reconnaissance variant. And again in that war, they were used to good success, but they were also, they lost quite a few. About 36 were shot down or otherwise completely destroyed, with another 6 or 7 so heavily damaged that they had to be written off. So much so that now the Nixon administration had to kind of give a quick emergency authorization to transfer 36 ex-U.S. Air Force F-4Es to the Israelis. It's also worth pointing out that while the RF-4Es were getting ready to go, the U.S. would loan Israel some of the older RF-4Cs for the reconnaissance. Well, moving past that war, up into 1976, in November of that year, the final ones were delivered. Backing up a bit, because they had received kind of a mix of old and new from different blocks of production around 1974 through 75, and of course onwards, the Israeli Air Force kind of had a program to upgrade and standardize their Kurnass fleet. Basically, just updating warning systems, radio technology, missile systems. In fact, they were one of the first to use the AIM-65 Maverick in combat. You know, just kind of get them to a certain standard level. And then, of course, from there, by around 1980, 1981, the air-to-air role, the frontline fighter role, was being handed over to the new F-16 and the F-15, which freed up the F-4s for more air-to-ground, air-to-surface missions. In fact, they were used to good success attacking targets in Syria in 1983. But by this time, the Kurnass 2000 program was well underway. This began around 1980, and they were going to do 2 prototypes, kind of retrofitting F-4Es, and this was a joint project between the Israel aircraft industry and the Israeli Air Force, or division of the IDF. And it was basically to kind of gut and rebuild. The 2000 looked the same externally with only a few minor changes, but internally they were really going to go the distance. They wanted to introduce new Pratt & Whitney engines. They had been considered adding canards since they had experience with them, the other fighters like the Kafir. They would introduce a new computer system. They would introduce a much more advanced and compact radar system. They would go to a more effective, larger heads-up display system. And they would introduce use of newer missiles, like you see on this one here, these big old ones, the so-called Popeye missile, known in America as the AGM-142 Havlight. These are air-to-surface missiles with some pretty impressive warheads. And they wouldn't just stop there. They would introduce new fuel tanks to try to decrease occurrences of leaking. They would introduce a fixed refueling probe for air-to-air refueling. They would give structural reinforcement because a lot of the Israeli aircraft were getting to be rather high mileage at this point. They would also introduce a few kind of external changes, strakes and fins here and there to improve maneuverability, handling. Now, not all of these changes would come to be. The canards were only briefly thought about but never really employed. The new engines actually were tested in 1986 and 1987, but in the end they stuck with the J-79. And some elements of the new radar system were not implemented, but others were. The whole idea was to extend the service life of the F-4E in the IAF for about 15 more years, hence the 2000. Well, the first prototype was ready for its test flight in July of 1987, and it performed well enough. And so in August, it was handed over to the Air Force for intensive flight testing. And they would continue this throughout 1988. And then on April 9, 1989, the first one was handed over to squadrons. And this would be the first true production model of the Kurnass 2000, and it would be handed over to squadrons for actual field use and training. And at this point, this new model really was different internally. Had new wiring. They put in new radios, reworked the cockpit in other ways, and it was pretty much a dedicated ground attacker. If you look at this one here, it has ECM pods, and it has the two big Popeye missiles. It has one Sidewinder for self-defense, and it still retains the 20mm Vulcan cannon. But that's really all that it would have for air-to-air. It was a ground attacker. They also continued to fly reconnaissance variants. Well, these would first be used in combat in February of 1991, attacking terrorist strongholds in Lebanon, and would continue to see use throughout the 1990s in various operations in the region. Again, mostly anti-terrorist type activities and what have you. It's also kind of interesting that Turkey got in on this. They also flew the F-4E, and there was a joint project with Israel Aircraft Industries, and several of the Turkish planes would receive very similar updates and upgrades. And it was reasonably effective and cost-effective at that. By the turn of the millennium, at least 3 squadrons in Israel still flew the updated F-4E, and they would continue to do so for a few more years. But by around 2004, they were retired out of active frontline service. This is at a time when newer aircraft were starting to come online. Newer models of the F-16, and eventually Israel would get the F-35 Lightning. Besides, but the program, the Kurnass 2000 program, was very much a success. It was meant to give it a 15-year longer lease on life, and it did. And the aircraft were used actively for over a decade. And of course, Israel received these on rather favorable terms from the USA, as you can imagine. But anywho, I thought this would be an interesting model to pick up. It is very similar to a standard F4, but it does have some strakes and whatnot that kind of set it apart. And the ordnance loadout is definitely unique. This is one of the few Hobby Masters that doesn't come with the Sparrow missile. And again, it has some interesting pods. Interesting fuel tank configuration too. And it's one of the last active Phantom variants in the world. So, I figured why not. So what do you think? Do you like the F-4E, the Kurnass 2000? Like I said, I think it's kind of an interesting critter. It has the usual Hobby Master features: gear up or down, you can display with ordnance on or off, cockpit open or closed, crew figures in or out, and it is mostly metal except for part of the tail and of course the fine details. But the wing and the fuselage are metal. Well, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to share them below. As always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.